It was a car built with the manners of a gentleman and the heart of a fortress. By the time the Second World War began, the Rolls-Royce Armoured Car was already something of an anachronism. Polished steel from an older age, pressed into service in a new kind of conflict. Yet, in the deserts of North Africa, on the roads of Ireland, and across the colonies of a shrinking empire, it refused to be forgotten. Forged first in the mud of the Great War, it had been designed for open plains and long distances, when speed was the only armour that mattered. By 1939 it was slow, heavy, and technically obsolete, and still it kept moving. Its crews called it reliable, its engineers called it dignified, and its enemies simply called it difficult to destroy, a machine that outlived its own doctrine, rolling from one war into another, as if unaware history had moved on. From Edwardian experiment to desert veteran, this is the story of the Rolls-Royce Armoured Car, how a relic of the First World War proved itself once more in the Second. When the First World War began, the British Army marched to war with horses, not horsepower. Its cavalry had not yet met the machine gun, and its generals still believed courage could outpace shrapnel. Then came 1914, barbed wire, trenches, and stalemate. The battlefield no longer moved, and armies that could not move were armies that could not win. From this paralysis came the need for armour that could travel. The early tanks were still years away, but engineers understood one thing immediately. A car could cross ground faster than a battalion, and a machine gun mounted on that car could change the rhythm of war, enter the Royal Naval Air Service, a branch of men with more enthusiasm than hierarchy, who decided that if the army could not move, they would. Using civilian Rolls-Royce chassis, they bolted steel plates to the sides, mounted a Vickers gun on top, and created something between a racing car and a pillbox. It was crude, noisy, and astonishingly effective. By 1915, these armoured cars were sweeping across Belgium, Gallipoli, and the deserts of Mesopotamia. The same vehicle that had once carried aristocrats to dinner now carried officers into battle, its polished bonnet replaced by steel sheeting, and its spirit of ecstasy replaced by a gunner's grim concentration. It was an age when invention moved faster than doctrine, an engineer's dream and a general's headache. Each car was powered by a 40 to 50 horsepower engine with a top speed near 45 miles per hour, unheard of for a fighting vehicle in that era. The cars needed smooth ground, so they performed best on open plains or hard sand, where their mechanical reliability gave British patrols an edge in range and surprise. By 1916, the demand for armoured mobility outgrew naval improvisation. The Army took note, and the concept of the armoured car became part of its evolving doctrine: mobile reconnaissance, convoy escort, and communication between scattered units. This was war without trenches, fought across continents that had not yet felt the weight of modern machines. From the coast of Namibia to the dunes of Arabia, the Rolls-Royce Armoured Car showed a simple truth. That movement was power, and steel could travel farther than flesh. The Great War would end, but the idea would not. It had begun as a naval experiment, but it would survive as a soldier's companion, a lesson learned too late for the Western Front, but just in time for the wars still to come. By the time the guns fell silent in 1918, the Rolls-Royce Armoured Car had done something unusual for a weapon of war. It had earned affection. Officers wrote of it not as a machine, but as a companion. Crews named them after wives, cities, and racehorses. And when peace arrived, no one wanted to see them scrapped. The War Office agreed. In 1920, a formal update was ordered, the Pattern 1920 model. It was a cleaner, more deliberate version of the improvisations of 1914. The chassis remained Rolls-Royce, but the armour was now properly designed, not hammered together by naval fitters. It carried a single point, 303 Vickers machine gun, in a fully rotating turret, with armour thick enough to stop rifle fire, yet light enough to keep that familiar 50 miles per hour road speed. The British had learned a rare lesson from victory. If something works, improve it quietly and keep it around. The new cars were deployed not in Europe's ruins, but in its empires. They patrolled the deserts of Mesopotamia, guarded pipelines, and led columns in the windswept expanses of the Middle East, where distance itself was often the enemy. Their Rolls-Royce engines, designed for long touring, thrived on open space. The same precision engineering that once impressed Mayfair now endured the sandstorms of Iraq and Transjordan. In 1921, the cars were used by the RAF Armoured Car Companies, units that effectively replaced cavalry in the Air Force's new control of the desert policy. They operated from bases that were little more than tin sheds and fuel drums, enforcing stability across territories Britain barely understood. The cars became instruments of presence, visible, mobile, and unrelenting. Mechanically, they were marvels of restraint. No heavy guns, no excess plating, just a reliable straight-six engine and carefully balanced weight. Maintenance crews could strip and rebuild one in the field using only hand tools and patience, both of which were vital in temperatures that melted bearings and boiled radiators. If the tank was the blunt fist of empire, the Rolls-Royce Armoured Car was its raised eyebrow, polite, deliberate, and difficult to argue with. Throughout the 1920s, the car was refined again, culminating in the 1924 pattern, an evolution that added stronger suspension, better tyres, and a reputation for indestructibility. By the 1930s, many of these cars were older than their drivers, yet still running. Some had logged more miles than entire squadrons of aircraft. In an empire that stretched across sand and stone, it became the mechanical face of British endurance. It represented a doctrine of minimal force and maximum mobility, an age when engineering filled the space between diplomacy and danger. The 1920 pattern. Rolls-Royce was no longer just a weapon. It was a policy on wheels. And as the world began to slide toward another war, this relic of an earlier one would once again be called upon to serve. By the late 1930s, the world had changed, but the Rolls-Royce Armoured Car had not. Factories that once built luxury limousines were now refitting steel veterans from another age, upgrading brakes, rewiring ignition systems, and replacing tyres that had worn out before the men who drove them were born. The process was not so much manufacture as resurrection. The original chassis, hand-built in Derby, was stripped of worn armour and fitted with new 1920 pattern turrets. Armourers welded fresh plates, mechanics rebored pistons, and everything that could be reused was, because the Empire's roads were long, but its budgets were not. Underneath, the straight-six 7.43-litre Rolls-Royce engine remained the same. Its output, around 80 horsepower, was unimpressive by the standards of 1939, yet its reliability was unmatched. It was said that if you kept it oiled, it would run until the desert ran out. It was the kind of engine that didn't roar. It hummed politely, like a butler clearing his throat. The 1920 MKE armoured car weighed just under 5 tons and had four-wheel drive only in theory. It was, in truth, a rear-wheel machine pretending to be a tank. But it handled long patrol routes across sand and rock with astonishing ease. The secret lay not in brute power, but in the balance between frame and armour, every plate cut to maintain near-perfect weight distribution. For maintenance crews, it was both a blessing and a burden. The car's bodywork demanded craftsmanship, not force. A dented plate meant hours of shaping and riveting, but when repaired properly, it returned to service smoother than before, as though the machine preferred attention to speed. The manufacturing philosophy was distinctly Rolls-Royce. No compromise. Even when compromise would have saved time, each unit received hand-fitted components. Tolerances were checked with feel, not gauges. Armour plates met along clean seams, as though built for a showroom rather than a battlefield. By 1938, with war again approaching, the remaining fleet of Rolls-Royce armoured cars, many built before the armistice of 1918, were inspected for reissue. They were not modern, but they were dependable. A tank might break its track or stall on steep sand. A Rolls-Royce, given fuel and a spare fan belt, would get there eventually. As new vehicles like the Humber and Daimler were still on drawing boards, the old Rolls-Royce models filled the gap, proving that good engineering, like good manners, endures long after fashion has changed. In an age of mass production, these cars were handmade reminders that precision could still outlast progress. When Britain went to war in 1939, the Rolls-Royce Armoured Car went with it, not as a weapon of conquest, but as a survivor of an earlier idea. That quality itself could be armour. When the Second World War broke out, the Rolls-Royce Armoured Car was already a museum piece in waiting. Yet, by 1940, in the blazing expanse of North Africa, it found itself back where it belonged. In the open, the Royal Air Force Armoured Car Companies took them to the desert, refitted once again, and painted in pale camouflage. They operated from makeshift bases, sheet metal sheds and sandbag revetments, conducting long-range patrols, airfield defence and reconnaissance. The desert was cruel to anything mechanical, but it was perfect for the Rolls-Royce. Its large wheels, high clearance and impeccable cooling system kept it running where heavier tanks faltered. It was the automotive equivalent of a stubborn old colonel, too old to keep up, too proud to stop. Each car's 80-horsepower engine pushed it to around 70 kilometers per hour on hard sand. Though crews rarely risked that speed, fuel was precious, and breakdowns meant long walks. Still, the Rolls-Royce became a vital part of the RAF's armoured patrols, eyes and ears over hundreds of empty miles. In one famous photograph, RAF armoured cars traverse the barren tracks of southern Arabia. Dust billows behind them, sunlight gleams off steel, and the image might as well have been 1918 all over again. These were the same cars, the same design, only the calendar had changed. The British Army in North Africa also made use of them, especially in the early years of the campaign, before purpose-built scout cars arrived. They guarded supply lines and surveyed routes across Libya and Egypt, proving once again that mobility was worth more than thickness of armour. Captured examples even found their way into Axis service. The Wehrmacht, ever pragmatic, repaired several and pressed them into use under the designation Panzerspähwagen RR206E, a German name for a very British ghost. That was the car's final complement. It was so well made, even the enemy kept it running. In the field, the men who drove them described the car as predictable, a quality more valuable than speed or firepower. The turret turned smoothly, even in scorching heat. The engine rarely overheated, its polished radiator badge often the only gleam of civilization in a wilderness of dust. Field tests became real battles, the cars holding observation posts, scouting enemy flanks, or escorting convoys between airfields. Though outclassed by newer armoured cars like the Humber and Marmon Harrington, the Rolls-Royce models continued to serve until spares finally ran out. For a design born in 1914, that was an extraordinary record. From the trenches to Tobruk, it had travelled through the entire mechanical age of war without ever losing its dignity. It had not just survived the test of combat, it had survived the test of time. Every machine reaches a moment when its age is no longer a number. It becomes a limitation. For the Rolls-Royce Armoured Car, that moment arrived in the early years of the Second World War. Armoured warfare had evolved at a pace no vehicle of 1914 could reasonably keep up with. Tanks had grown heavier, faster, and more specialised aircraft could now destroy a vehicle from beyond the horizon. Radios were no longer luxuries, but necessities. Yet, in the vast emptiness of the Western Desert, the Rolls-Royce found a final phase where it still mattered. The RAF Armoured Car Companies relied on them during the 1940–41 campaigns, their long range and quiet reliability fitting perfectly into the harsh logic of desert patrol work. They escorted convoys to remote landing strips, scouted ahead of columns, and performed route reconnaissance across hundreds of miles of unforgiving terrain. Their most important contribution came during a series of long-range patrols in 1941, when they supported air operations over Libya. While newer armoured cars often suffered mechanical failures, the Rolls-Royce kept moving. The key was not raw strength, but mechanical honesty, a vehicle designed before mass production, built with a craftsman's confidence rather than a factory's haste. It was old, yes, but it behaved like a machine that had read the manual and decided to rise to the occasion. But there were failures too, and they were not subtle. The armour was thin by 1940 standards, barely enough to stop heavy rifle rounds, let alone anti-tank weapons or aircraft strafing runs. Its Vickers machine gun, while dependable, lacked the punch to deal with newer, armoured opponents. The turret rotation, though smooth, was manual and slow. When crews faced Italian or German armoured cars fitted with 20mm autocannons, the disparity was immediately obvious. These weaknesses meant that by 1942 the vehicles could no longer serve on the front line. The British Army replaced them with more modern cars. The RAF, faced with shortages, kept them longer, but even they could not deny that time had caught up. The Rolls-Royce Armoured Car was no longer a weapon of opportunity. It was a symbol of endurance being asked to fight a war designed for machines 2 decades younger. To understand its twilight, we must also look at the interwar years, when vehicles of the same pattern served in Ireland. The Rolls-Royce Armoured Car seen on Henry Street in Dublin during the Irish Civil War represented a period when the British-built machines found themselves operating in newly independent or contested territories. Their use there was not part of the Second World War, but it shaped the understanding of what these vehicles could and could not do: fast response, urban presence, and disciplined mobility. They were engineered for open ground, yet adapted to constrained streets, proving that a machine's legacy could extend far beyond the conflict it was designed for. In Wexford, 1922, represented by the photograph of Captain McAllister, the car's presence echoed the same qualities: resilience and visibility. These operations shaped the doctrines later used in overseas policing and early World War II reconnaissance deployments. Although the machines in those Irish photographs cannot be placed directly in the North African campaigns, they belong to the same technological lineage and illustrate the vehicle's broader historical weight. By 1943, most Rolls-Royce armoured cars on World War II duty had been retired, dismantled for parts, or reassigned to training roles failure had not defeated them. Time simply decreed that newer tools were needed. And yet the fundamental truth remained: the Rolls-Royce Armoured Car had done its job not once, but 3 times, in the Great War, the uneasy peace that followed, and the Desert War that came after. It had been overtaken, yes, but never outclassed in the one attribute that mattered most: staying power. The Rolls-Royce Armoured Car did more than serve in wars. It shaped the quiet spaces between them. When Britain emerged from the First World War, it held territories from the Middle East to the Mediterranean, each with its own tensions, borders, and demands for stability. The armoured car became a tool of presence, reassurance, and occasionally intimidation, long before the word counterinsurgency entered official vocabulary. In the 1920s and 1930s, British armoured vehicles, including Rolls-Royce models and their close successors, paraded through cities such as Tel Aviv, illustrating a doctrine that mixed mobility with symbolism. They were not there to overpower, but to be seen, steel diplomacy on narrow streets. The parades reinforced that the Empire's reach was more about movement than mass. A handful of mobile units could stabilize an area more efficiently than an entire garrison fixed in place. This idea that agility could substitute for size carried into the Second World War the RAF Armoured Car Companies in North Africa, who operated largely with the descendants of these early designs, relied on methods learned during interwar policing. They understood that in vast, sparsely populated regions, machines that could travel far mattered more than machines that could hit hard. Their patrol logic, their radio discipline, their ability to navigate open ground with almost no landmarks, these were interwar lessons applied directly to a continental war. Meanwhile, back in Ireland, the use of armoured cars during the Civil War and the turbulent years that followed left an impression on how authorities approached urban conflict. The photograph from the Dublin siege, with armoured cars positioned on narrow streets, is not evidence of Rolls-Royce participation in World War II, but it shows how the same class of vehicles established expectations of mobility in confined environments. Urban operations demanded visibility, restraint, and the ability to respond rapidly without escalating force. Armoured cars, with their modest weaponry and high mobility, became symbols of controlled authority rather than military dominance. This was the quiet consequence of their design, a war machine that taught governments how to move without overwhelming. The Rolls-Royce also inadvertently shaped mechanical expectations. Drivers in the Middle East grew accustomed to vehicles that refused to break down. Mechanics learned the value of modular parts, easy repairs, and predictable cooling behavior, crucial factors when later vehicles like the Humber and Daimler entered service officers came to expect a reconnaissance car to behave with the same civility as the old Rolls-Royce, even though few post-war designs ever achieved its blend of reliability and elegance. Photographs from the interwar years show Rolls-Royce armoured cars still patrolling long after their frontline relevance had ended. Each deployment carried a political undertone, a subtle reminder that mobility could govern spaces as effectively as fortification. The fact that these cars survived to be used, even symbolically, in the era just before World War II reveals the scale of their influence. A weapon intended for the mud of Flanders became a kind of imperial administrator, unsentimental, deliberate, and always moving. The hidden consequence of its service was not destruction, but expectation. It taught soldiers, engineers, and policymakers that a small, well-engineered machine could project stability across thousands of miles. And when a new world war arrived, those expectations carried forward, shaping everything from desert reconnaissance to post-war colonial policing. In its quiet way, the Rolls-Royce armoured car redrew the map, not with force, but with movement. When the Second World War finally ended, the Rolls-Royce armoured car was older than many of the men who had driven it. Most military vehicles do not live to see peace. They are scrapped, melted, or left to rust where they broke down. But the Rolls-Royce was different, because its life had never belonged solely to war. In some corners of the world, it continued in service for several years after 1945. A handful in the Middle East patrolled remote routes where reliability mattered more than firepower. Others sat in reserve depots, their armour still sound, their engines ready to run if fuel was poured into their tanks. They were not so much retired as gently persuaded to rest. As modern armoured cars replaced them, the older Rolls-Royce fleets slowly disappeared, not through catastrophic failure, but through dignified obsolescence. Museums recognized this, preserving examples not as relics, but as milestones in engineering. The car displayed at Ahmednagar Cavalry Tank Museum in India stands today in quiet testimony, its steel plates still crisp, its silhouette unmistakably Edwardian. A visitor might mistake it for a survivor of the Great War alone, yet its history carried on through 2 global conflicts, and the entire interwar age restorers have taken the car's legacy even further. The Haynes Museum's restored desert pattern Rolls-Royce, painted pale sand and fitted with its tall turret, is perhaps the closest living echo of the cars that patrolled North Africa. Restoration teams discovered that the original engine, when properly serviced, still runs with remarkable smoothness. Even after a century, its bearings rotate with that distinctive Rolls-Royce confidence. It is one thing for a vintage engine to start, it is quite another for it to start as if mildly offended you doubted it. Enthusiasts have built replicas too, using original plans where possible and improvising where documentation no longer exists. These replicas prove a deeper truth. The Rolls-Royce Armoured Car occupies a unique place in mechanical memory. It is not celebrated for sheer power or armour thickness. Instead, it stands for something rarer, longevity earned through balanced design, careful engineering, and a philosophy that valued precision over excess. Its influence on later British armoured doctrine is understated but undeniable. Vehicles like the Humber, Daimler, and even post-war Ferret Scout cars all inherited aspects of its design priorities. Reliability first, mobility second, armour a distant but necessary third. The Rolls-Royce taught engineers that a machine does not succeed through extremes, but through consistency across every component. Even today, driving one of the few surviving originals is an education. The controls are lighter than expected, the engine note is soft, the turret turns with surprising grace. It does not feel like a weapon. It feels like a machine built by people who expected it to last a lifetime, and were proved correct. Most war machines become obsolete, then vanish. The Rolls-Royce Armoured Car became obsolete, adapted, endured, and finally became something else entirely, a mechanical bridge between eras. Its legacy is not the battles it fought, but the time it spanned, from biplanes and cavalry charges to Spitfires and radar. Few machines have lasted so long without ever being redesigned for longevity. It simply lasted because it refused not to. A century after its creation, the Rolls-Royce Armoured Car sits in museums with a quiet confidence. It is neither imposing nor fragile. It simply occupies its space as though it has every right to be there. And perhaps that is the final truth of it. A machine that survived by refusing to be hurried, frightened, or forgotten. When viewed beside tanks and armoured personnel carriers that dwarf it, the Rolls-Royce looks almost modest, thin armour, simple lines, a single Vickers gun. Yet those who study its history quickly realise it achieved something far rarer than battlefield domination. It remained relevant long after the era that had produced it was swept away. That longevity, not its firepower, is the measure of its achievement. Its origins were chaotic, a wartime improvisation with steel plates bolted onto a luxury chassis. But from that moment, it grew into a design that embodied an engineering philosophy. Britain rarely states, but often follows, reliability is worth more than reinvention. The car that patrolled Mesopotamia in 1917 was not so different from the one that scouted Libya in 1941, and the crews who depended on it did so with a trust born of years, not months. It was never the strongest, never the fastest, but it was always the machine that turned up. The Rolls-Royce Armoured Car also left a philosophical legacy that transcends steel. It demonstrated that endurance in engineering is not an accident. It is the product of harmony between design, purpose, and environment. Vehicles that attempt to be everything often become nothing. Vehicles that focus on one principle, in this case dependable mobility, become institutions. Look closely at its preserved examples, and you can still see the marks of its journeys. Rivet lines shaped by hand tools, turret seams filed smooth, suspension components built to cope with distances rather than violence. Every element tells the same story, a design that chose refinement over ambition. Its appearance in the closing years of the First World War, and again in the early years of the Second, bookends one of the most dramatic technological transformations in human history. The world that built it no longer existed by the time it retired, and yet the car bridged those eras without ever pretending to be more than it was. The final images of it in service, rolling down desert tracks, crossing hard-pan sand, or sitting quietly beside airfield huts, reveal a machine at peace with its own limitations. A relic, yes, but not an anachronism. It fulfilled duties no one expected it to survive long enough to perform. Its story ends not with a final battle, but with a final truth. Longevity, when earned honestly, is its own form of victory. And so the Rolls-Royce Armoured Car leaves history much as it entered it, steady, reliable, and entirely itself, not a titan of war, but a companion to the people who needed it, a machine from an older world that helped shape a newer one, simply by enduring long enough to be remembered.